Ladies and gentlemen, the session is about to begin. Please take your seats.
Can I have your attention, please? Good afternoon. I'm Mort Halperin. I'm the Vice Chairman of J Street, and it is my great pleasure. I take that was for J Street, and I appreciate it. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this plenary session, which is focused on the American role, what it is, and what it should be in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But before I introduce our distinguished speakers who are joining us in person, I am very pleased that we have a very special greeting to bring to the conference from Israeli President Shimon Peres. As you know, he has been among the loudest and the clearest voices speaking about the urgency of creating a two-state solution for the sake of preserving both the Jewish and the democratic identity of Israel. And it's an honor for J Street that he has sent this welcoming message. Thank you.
Dear friends, my best wishes to your convention. It is an important gathering. We have to come together to face a new world and to offer to our children a new agenda. The new world contains great dangers and great hopes. Specifically, when it comes to Israel, the danger is of an Iranian nature, namely a country that threatens to destroy another country, Israel. To face it, we have to understand that this is not just a danger to Israel, it's a menace to the entire world. Iran is trying to build a coalition of evil forces. They have agencies like Hezbollah and Hamas, and they try to convince or to conquer other countries. Against this evil coalition, we have to form and act as a coalition of light and security. Headed by the United States, I can see that the President of America is trying to build such a coalition because the danger is all over the places. And most leaders that I spoke with recognize it and feel that unless the danger of Iran, which is a combination of terror and trying to build a nuclear bomb, will be over, Israel will be a very loyal member in this coalition, and all of us agree that the first step should be not a shooting war, but other means. If we can achieve it, to overcome this danger by other means, it's much better. Then on the other side, there is a great hope, a hope for peace, and a hope specifically for peace in Israel. I do believe that most of the Palestinian leaders, I do believe that the heads of the Palestinian Authority, Mr. Abbas and Fayyad, are convinced that peace is the best answer for them, as for us. We made a long way because peace you have to build, not just to negotiate. And in the meantime, the Palestinians are building a state of their own with the support and agreement of Israel. There is no other solution but a two-state solution. Otherwise, you can make one state that two people will quarrel endlessly and bitterly within this state. It won't be a binational state. It will be a state of quarrel between two nations endlessly. And I think this is more or less accepted by most of the leaders in the world. I think by the Arabs and Israel too. People are trying to say it's hard to achieve. Well, any great thing, any true thing is hard to achieve, but it is achievable. I know that you support the two-state solution, and we appreciate it very much. I think we have to keep our link together and offer a new agenda for a young generation. I think that this new agenda should be based on the preference of the moral call in whatever we do. Judaism without morality is untrue to its past and doesn't have a message for the future. The Ten Commandments are a document that we kept and we have to keep for the future. Then the Jewish people were always hungry for wisdom, for knowledge, for science. The future of humanity depends today more on wisdom than on wars, more on science than on land, more on knowledge than on ignorance. And this great tradition in Jewish life must be enhanced and enforced and offered to every young woman or man. And the third point is to make peace. The world today is made of so many differences and biases and prejudices and disagreements and dangerous weapons. To make peace all over the places and to make peace here in the Middle East is a great call and a great challenge. Finally, we Jewish people were never satisfied with the existing situation. Our orientation is in the future, for a better man, for a better world, for a better hope to posterity. Tikkun Olam. I'm sure that you can contribute, as you do, to make our life better, more secure, more reasonable, more honest, more attractive. God bless you.
As you know, J Street has been in Washington only slightly longer than the Obama administration. And over the past 4 years, we have consistently supported the President's vision for peace and security in the Middle East and for the security of Israel through a two-state solution. So we are very pleased to be joined this afternoon by two very senior members of the administration who will be providing keynote remarks for this conference. We will first hear from Valerie Jarrett, who, as you know, is Senior Advisor to the President. Before joining the administration, she was the Chief Executive Officer of the Habitat Company, and before that served as a Senior Advisor to the Obama presidential campaign and to the Obama-Biden transition team. We recognize her, as I say, as one of the President's closest and most important advisors, and it is my great pleasure to invite her to the podium.
Thank you, thank you. Oh my goodness, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Good afternoon. You guys look terrific out there. It is such a pleasure for me to be here. I want to begin by thanking Mort for that great introduction and also for his long service to our country. Could we have a round of applause for Mort? Thank you. I also want to thank the three people who invited me to be here today: Jeremy, David and Deborah Singer, who I had a chance to just say hello to them. Thank you all very much. And when I look around the audience, I see so many friends, but I have to, as a point of personal privilege, just name a few. First, there's Judd and Linda Miner, who are the Miners. Judd hired me into the public sector for the first time many, many moons ago, and he also hired the president when he came out of law school, so it's certainly safe to say I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Judd. And then two other dear friends from Chicago, Marilyn Katz and Bill Singer, both who I've known far too many years for me to admit to you right here. So hello to my friends from Chicago as well. In just a few minutes, you're going to hear from Tony Blinken, my dear friend. And when you look up foreign policy expert into the dictionary, who do you see but a photograph of Tony? So rather than diving deeply into the details of the president's foreign policy, I know Tony will do that very capably. So I thought instead I would speak more broadly about the president's vision and his values. There's no better time to address those themes than right now, with Passover just a few weeks away. Passover is a very special holiday for me. Many, many years ago, a Jewish friend of mine asked if we could prepare Seder at my parents' home because her family was out of town. My parents, of course, agreed, and in the course of dinner, my father surprised me by casually mentioning that his grandfather was Jewish. Now, I know you're thinking, she doesn't really look 1/8 Jewish, but I am, which is why I promise that when I use Hebrew words in my speech today, I'll pronounce at least 1 out of 8 correctly. Passover also holds a very special place in the heart of President Obama. One of our favorite memories during the presidential race was in the spring of 2008. At the end of a very long and grueling day, a few of the young Jewish aides traveling with then-Senator Obama organized a small Seder in the basement of a hotel in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. They used borrowed Haggadahs and makeshift Seder plates, and for a couple of the guys, the young ones, it was their first time that they'd ever spent Passover away from home. The president heard that they were planning the Seder, and even though he had given 5 speeches that day, and I had attended all of them, that was a very heavy lift for me, and it was 10 o'clock when we finally arrived at our hotel, he said to me, "Come on, let's join them." The two organizers were so overwhelmed that their exhausted boss decided to join them that they offered to skip certain passages to save time. Yeah, you're laughing. You know about that, don't you? Well, he firmly encouraged them to do just what they would do if they were at home, because on that night, we were their family. At the end of the Seder, we raised our glasses to say, "Next year in Jerusalem." And the president then raised his glass a second time, and he said that if he won the election, next year in the White House. Well, the president kept his promise, and this year I'm looking forward to the 4th annual White House Seder that we have shared with the same group that joined us that evening in Harrisburg every single year, together with the president's wife, the First Lady, Sasha, and Malia. This tradition is cherished by the Obama family and all of their guests, and not just because we all appreciate a good bowl of matzo ball soup, though we do. As Jews around the world prepare to celebrate Passover, they reflect on the meaning of freedom. They retell a story that renews our faith in a brighter tomorrow. These are powerful themes that run throughout Jewish history and through American history. They are part of the Jewish tradition. They are part of the American tradition. So is it any wonder that American Jews have contributed so much to our country? Guided by faith, by history, and by a belief in the Tikkun Ha'olam, your community has always helped to make our union more perfect. Of course, within any community or any country, there are often fierce disagreements, over which path to take going forward. And that debate is part of what makes our democracy work. But we must always remember that the shared values that unite us are far greater than what divides us. That was a message that a little-known state senator from Illinois delivered in the 2004 Democratic Convention. He said that our politics must reflect our most deeply held beliefs, including that common creed that I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper. He struck a chord deep within the hearts of so many. His vision inspired people of all backgrounds here in America and around the world. It became the foundation of a presidential campaign, and it remains the essence of the president's mission each and every day as he fights for America where nobody gets left behind, everybody gets a fair shot, everybody does their fair share, and everybody plays by the same set of rules. Now, don't get me wrong. Change is not easy. And as we say from Chicago, it is not for the faint at heart. That's for sure. And it takes time. But in a little more than 3 years, we have all developed a few more gray hairs. People think that the president's gray hair is very funny. Mine not so funny, actually. But we've earned each and every one. As the Jewish tradition teaches us, while we're not obligated to finish the work, neither are we free to desist from it. In that spirit, we must never give up. We must never stop fighting to make our shared vision a reality. And today, we're beginning to see what change looks like. Change is pulling our country back from the brink of the worst economy since the Great Depression, and then putting in place the rules of the road that will prevent a repeat of the 2008 disaster. We still have a long way to go, but in the last 24 months, we have seen private sector job growth each and every month, creating a total of 3.9 million jobs. Manufacturers are hiring at levels that we haven't seen since the 1990s, and the American auto industry is back on top, with GM reemerging as the #1 car manufacturer in the world. President Obama had faith in the American worker, and that bet paid off. That's what change looks like to me. Change is the very first bill that President Obama signed when he took office, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which helps protect a woman's right to equal pay. Glad to see the men were clapping too. Now, why does this give President Obama so much pride? Because he watched his grandmother and his mother and his wife strive for equality in the workplace, and he is determined that his daughters will grow up in a world where they too can compete on an even playing field. Change is reducing our dependence on foreign oil to below 50% for the first time in more than a decade. It's putting in place tough new fuel efficiency standards for cars and trucks, and investing in America-made energy, including wind and solar. Just last week, I had the opportunity to travel with the president to 4 states in 2 days, and we visited solar plants and oil fields and pipelines, and we saw the president's all-of-the-above energy strategy firsthand at work. All of the progress that we are making on the American-made energy is good for the economy, it's good for our entire country, it's good for the environment, and it strengthens our national security. Change is passing comprehensive health reform. Glad to hear it. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, we celebrated our second anniversary just last week, and of course today is a very important day at the Supreme Court. It's for the 2.5 million Americans under the age of 26 who are already on their parents' insurance, thanks to the new law. My own daughter, Laura, when she finished law school, she had a 3-month gap before she started practicing law, so I know firsthand how important the Affordable Care Act is to the senior citizens who've already received rebate checks to help them with prescription drugs so they don't have to choose between buying groceries and buying their medicine, or even worse, cutting their medicine in half trying to make it stretch. It's parents who no longer have to worry about paying for a sick child's treatment because the child can no longer be denied coverage for having pre-existing conditions. Change is protecting a woman's right to make her own choices about her health Yes, indeed. And just to be clear, that includes giving a woman access to essential preventive care such as mammograms and, yes, contraception without a copay. That's what change is. And change is living by our most deeply held values, not just at home, but around the world. Change is restoring America's standing in the world. Change is ensuring that every American can serve in the military and be prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice to protect our country, no matter who they love. When I was home over the holidays in December, I saw so many service members in the airports, and I teared up knowing that many had served their last tour of duty in Iraq because change is the president keeping his promise to end the war in Iraq. And change is responsibly winding down the war in Afghanistan. And because of the bravery of our men and women in uniform, change is sleeping a little easier knowing that Osama bin Laden and his lieutenants are no longer threatening the world. That's what change looks like to me, and I hope it's what it looks like to you as well. When it comes to the Middle East, President Obama is steadfastly determined to live up to our most deeply held values. An unbreakable bond with the State of Israel that combines a commitment to the Jewish state and its security with a commitment to a just and lasting peace. Now, we know that many of you are sometimes frustrated with the state of the peace process. We have a lot of work ahead because, as President Obama has said, true peace cannot be imposed from the outside, but only can be reached by Israeli and Palestinians coming together to reach agreement on the issues that divide them. Still, President Obama believes that we must fight for lasting peace, because now more than ever, it is clear that peace is in the long-term interests of Israel. It is in the long-term interests of the Palestinian people. It is in the interests of the region. It's in the interests of the United States, and it's in the interests of the world. Last year, the president told the Union for Reform Judaism, "I am not going to stop in pursuit of that vision. It is the right thing to do." Now, President Obama has been very clear that pursuing peace does not mean ignoring the dangers facing America and its allies. The President has made clear that the United States' commitment to Israel's security is ironclad. He backed up those words. He has backed up those words with record levels of security assistance, our largest ever joint exercises, and the most comprehensive and meaningful strategic and operational consultation all across all levels of our government in the history of our relationship. And that is vital in the face of the common threat of Iran and its illicit nuclear pursuits. The President has also made it clear that he is prepared to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. And I know this President. I know him very well, 20 years now. He means what he says, and he says what he means. Just today, earlier today in Seoul, the President, working with Russia and China to keep the international community united and Iran isolated. And he will continue this effort because that is what this threat demands. You know, when I began talking about the Passover story today, it reminded me that I have this honor of chairing the White House Council of Women and Girls. And given that this is Women's History Month, I thought it would be appropriate to conclude my remarks with a story involving Miriam. It's a story which I am sure is very familiar to all of you. The book of Exodus tells us that after the Israelites crossed the Red Sea and the Egyptian army was destroyed, Miriam and fellow women took their timbrels and began to dance. From this passage, we learn that when those who wish to destroy us are defeated, we have the right, perhaps the obligation, to celebrate. But at the same time, the Jewish tradition does not ignore the deeper moral complexities that exist, even when we are on the right side of a conflict. The Talmud teaches that when the Red Sea closed back on the Egyptians, the angels in the heaven wished to sing a song of praise. But God rebuked them, saying, "My handiwork is drowning in the sea." To me, these passages put side by side remind us that we must make our decisions based on the world as it is. But we must also hold in our hearts a vision for the world as it could be, as it should be. It is far simpler to be guided only by fear and never by hope. But that's not who we are. That's not what we have ever been, and ultimately, that is not the best way to protect the freedoms we all cherish. President Obama understands this well. He knows that we will not be able to beat all our swords into the plowshares anytime soon. But we can still be inspired by the idea that, in the words of the Jewish tradition, the day will come when nation shall not lift up a sword against nation. Neither shall people learn war anymore. So the President will continue to stand for both freedom and peace, common security and common dignity. And that's a hard thing to do, but we do hard things. President Obama is determined to achieve these goals because he believes that together we can make our own history. He's more confident than ever that even as we confront the most urgent challenges of the present, we can build a foundation for a brighter future. If you share that belief, if you think we must never stop fighting for our shared values, both here at home and around the world, then I urge you to speak up. Whether it's around your family dinner table, or in your congregation, or in your community, or here in Washington, we all have an individual and collective responsibility to stand up and let our voices be heard. If we do this together, there is no doubt that we will continue, step by step, to make progress towards that more perfect union and a better and safer world. Because, in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So let's grab the arc and let's bend it together. And in the theme of your conference, let's make history. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those terrific remarks. I think telling this audience to speak its mind is likely to find resonance with at least some of you. It is now my great pleasure to introduce an old friend, Tony Blinken, who, as you all know, is the National Security Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden and also a senior member of President Obama's national security team. Tony has been a longtime advisor to the Vice President and served as the staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when Senator Biden was the chair of that committee. He was also a member of the National Security Council staff during the Clinton administration. As you know, we have a plenary session on this subject, which will conclude with a roundtable after we hear from Tony. But now it is my great pleasure to welcome him to the stage.
Good afternoon. You've been to the mountaintop with Valerie. Now it's time to come back into the valley. I got to tell you, it's a little bit daunting to follow Valerie, who is the president's closest advisor. It's a little daunting to follow even a video of Shimon Peretz. And it reminds me a little bit of Alan and Rossi and their predicament. And for those of you who don't immediately react to the name Alan and Rossi, that's exactly the point. They were the act that followed the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. I want to thank all of you for being here. This is an extraordinary turnout. I especially want to thank my friend and former colleague, Jarrett for inviting me to join you. And just as Valerie used a point of personal privilege to single out a few people, I want to do the same thing, if you'll permit me, because there are three very good friends and special people who are here today who I just want to acknowledge at the outset. And the first, of course, is Mort Halperin. Mort and I were colleagues during the Clinton administration. Mort started serving his country, I believe, under President Lyndon Johnson, and hasn't stopped since. You're also, I think, going to hear shortly from Dan Kurtzer. For nearly 30 years, one of our nation's most effective and distinguished diplomats, and now a leading analyst of our core national security challenges. And last but not least, a very dear friend, Anne-Marie Slaughter, a charter member of the Obama administration's foreign policy team. Sadly, she's left us for the very, very difficult waters of Princeton University, but as a world-class scholar, as someone who remains deeply engaged in international affairs. Thank you. But mostly what I want to do is I want to start by thanking all of you, every one of you in this room, for the work that you do every single day. In just a few short years, J Street has emerged as an influential and constructive voice, not just here in Washington, but far beyond. That voice, your voice, strengthens America's foreign policy. It's a vital contribution to one of America's closest and most important international relationships, and indeed one of our most important national security priorities, Israel. As Mort said, the session that is about to start is focused on what the United States can do to advance the cause of peace between Israel and its neighbors. So what I'd like to do is to focus a little bit on what the Obama administration has been doing and our approach to this most critical and perhaps most elusive of American foreign policy objectives. Israel's own leaders, as you just heard, understand the imperative for peace. Prime Minister Netanyahu, Defense Minister Barak, President Shimon Peretz have each called for two states, a secure Jewish state of Israel that lives side by side with an independent Palestinian state. That is their goal. That is our goal. As Valerie said, that vision is profoundly in Israel's security interest and is, in our judgment, the best solution to the host of very difficult, indeed increasingly difficult challenges that it faces, from shifting demographics that will eventually jeopardize its status as a Jewish democracy, to emerging weapons technologies, to the historic changes that are sweeping the entire region. And of course, peace is the only sure way for the Palestinian people to realize their legitimate and long-standing aspirations for a state of their own. You heard Shimon Peres say it, and we believe it too. In President Abbas and Prime Minister Fayyad, Israel has partners who share the goal of peace. Now, most of you in this room, starting with Ambassador Kurtzer, who's been down this bumpy road just a few times before, you know as well as I do how difficult the road to peace will be. But as Valerie said, the United States has a profound interest in this peace. And both Israelis and Palestinians continue to believe that our involvement is important and indeed even critical to progress. So as President Obama said recently, while there are those who question whether this goal will ever be reached, we make no apologies for continuing to pursue peace. Just because we don't say something or you don't see something doesn't mean we're not doing it. We remain deeply engaged with Israel and the Palestinians, starting with the President, who, as you know, saw Prime Minister Netanyahu earlier this month and spoke last week with President Abbas. We continue to work closely, day in, day out, with the Quartet and with our Arab partners. And in particular, we supported the recent talks that King Abdullah's government convened in Amman, Jordan, which we believe produced serious and meaningful discussions between Israelis and Palestinians. We're now in what the diplomats like to call a period of assessment. We remain in close consultation with the parties, with the Jordanians, and our other partners on the way forward. But as you know, nothing happens in a vacuum. We've made no secret of our concern about the agreement between Fatah and Hamas that was announced in Doha recently. Our policy on Hamas has not changed. It is a designated foreign terrorist organization, and to play any role in achieving a lasting peace and building an independent state for the Palestinians, it must renounce violence, it must recognize Israel, it must adhere to past agreements. Now, we believe that President Abbas remains committed to these principles, and he's told us that any government he leads will remain committed to them too. President Obama has also made clear that there will be no lasting peace unless Israel is secure, period. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to talk for a few minutes about that, because there's a lot of misinformation out there, and it's very important that you in this room, and indeed every American, know the facts. For more than 60 years since Israel's founding, during periods of war and peace, calm and crisis, U.S. administrations of all stripes have worked to safeguard Israel's security. But I would maintain that no administration and no president has done as much as President Obama with Israel and for Israel's security. Last fall, President Obama's personal intervention helped avert a catastrophe when a violent mob stormed the Israeli embassy in Cairo, Egypt. Afterward, this is what Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said of President Obama, and I quote, "I requested his assistance at a decisive, I would say even fateful moment. He said he would do everything possible, and that is what he did. He activated all of the United States' means and influence, which are certainly considerable. I believe we owe him a special debt of gratitude." That influence was but one vivid manifestation of our administration's ironclad commitment to Israel's security, a commitment that has led to a level of cooperation that Prime Minister Netanyahu himself has called, and I quote, unprecedented. And that commitment starts with President Obama and his own personal profound understanding of Israel's predicament. Here's how the President put it last fall, speaking to the countries of the world at the United Nations General Assembly, and I quote again. He said, "Let us be honest with ourselves. Israel is surrounded by neighbors that have waged repeated wars against it. Israel's citizens have been killed by rockets fired at their houses and suicide bombs on their buses. Israel's children come of age knowing that throughout the region, other children are taught to hate them. Israel, a small country of less than 8 million people, looks at a world where leaders of much larger nations threaten to wipe it off the map," end quote. Now, that understanding translates into something beyond words. It translates into deeds that have done more than ever before for Israel's security. If you have friends or relatives in southern Israel, they can tell you exactly what that's meant in recent weeks. In addition to the record levels of security assistance we've already provided Israel, our administration secured, as some of you know, an additional $205 million to help produce something called Iron Dome, the short-range rocket defense system. During the recent attacks on Israel from Gaza, Iron Dome intercepted nearly 80% of the rockets it engaged. Dozens of deadly explosives that might otherwise have fallen on homes, on schools, on hospitals. Iron Dome has been a godsend for besieged communities along Israel's border with Gaza, and it's now been installed in the north as well, along Lebanon's border. Now, to guard against more distant but also more dangerous threats, we worked with Israel on the Arrow weapon system to intercept medium-range ballistic missiles and on David's Sling for shorter-range missiles. And we've collaborated on a powerful radar system linked to U.S. early warning satellites that could buy Israel valuable time in the event of a missile attack. But you know, it's more than about material and technology. It's also about relationships. And Valerie said this earlier. We have launched the most comprehensive and meaningful strategic and operational consultations across all levels of governments in the history of our alliance with Israel. Last year, nearly 200 senior-level Department of Defense officials visited Israel, and senior Israeli officials visit the United States just as often. Later this year, our nation's armed forces will conduct their largest ever joint military exercise, Austere Challenge. And despite tough fiscal times, President Obama has requested $3.1 billion in military assistance for 2013, the most ever. We know that Israel sees the threat posed by Iran as literally existential. And make no mistake, an Iran armed with nuclear weapons would pose a direct and serious threat to the security of the United States as well. That's why, as the President said a couple of weeks ago, we do not have a policy of containment. We are determined to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. Now, you've all heard a lot of loud talk about Iran, and you're likely to hear a little bit more in the coming months. This loose talk of war, as President Obama describes it, is incredibly counterproductive. And you know why. Let me tell you why. What happens when we talk up war? Well, it benefits Iran. It drives the price of oil up. And the money goes out of our pocket and right into Iran's pocket. It dilutes the impact of sanctions, which, as I'll talk about in a few moments, are having a tremendous impact. And it feeds false hope that it's possible to drive a wedge between the United States and Israel. So for the sake of Israel's security, America's security, and the peace and security of the world, our approach is different. We believe now is the time to speak softly, but carry a big stick, to let our increased pressure stick in, and to leverage the broad international coalition that we have built. It's possible to be smart and tough at the same time. The United States and Israel both assess that Iran does not yet have a nuclear weapon, and we are exceedingly vigilant in monitoring their program and their efforts. There remains time and space for diplomacy, backed by increasing pressure, to succeed. Iran's leaders still have the opportunity to make the right decision and abandon their current course. And we've backed up that commitment by building an unprecedented coalition to impose the most far-reaching sanctions that Iran has ever faced. As a result, Iran finds itself increasingly isolated from the international community. It finds it harder than ever before to acquire materials for its nuclear and missile programs, to conduct transactions in dollars and euros. It struggled to buy refined petroleum and the goods it needs to modernize its oil and gas sector. Already something like $60 billion in Iranian energy-related projects have been put on hold or shut down. World-leading companies are deciding to stop doing business there. Companies like Shell, Total, Eni, Statoil, Repsol, Lukoil, Kia, Toyota, Siemens, and many others, and the foreign subsidiaries of U.S. firms like GE, Honeywell, and Caterpillar, among many others. And most recently, we've worked with Congress to make sanctionable a host of transactions involving the Central Bank of Iran. And we're working with partners to implement this new law in a way that maximizes the pressure on the Iranian regime. The regime is feeling the pressure. Don't take my word for it or the administration's word for it. I'm not used to quoting him, but here's what the Iranian president, Ahmadinejad, had to say about sanctions to Iran's parliament very late last year. And I quote, "The West has imposed the most extensive and dastardly sanctions ever. Every day, all our banking and trade activities and our agreements are being monitored and blocked. This is the heaviest economic onslaught in a nation in history." The purpose of this pressure is not punishment. It is to convince Iran that the price to be paid for failing to meet its international obligations is too high, and the time is now to make good on its commitments to the international community. Finally, standing up for Israel's security also means remaining ever vigilant against attempts to delegitimize Israel in the international arena. As President Obama has said, including in a speech he delivered in Cairo at the start of the administration, Israel's legitimacy is not a matter for debate. That's why we stood by Israel last week. That's why we stood by Israel last week at the Human Rights Council in Geneva and voted against a one-sided resolution that will not advance the cause of peace, but instead will distract from efforts to help the parties get to direct negotiations. That's why we stood up strongly for Israel's right to defend itself after the Goldstone report on the 2009 Gaza war was issued. That's why when Israel was isolated in the aftermath of the flotilla incident, we supported Israel. That's why we refused to attend events that endorse or commemorate the flawed 2001 World Conference Against Racism. We will always reject attempts to equate Zionism with racism. And that's why we oppose attempts to introduce the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into the United Nations or its agencies, because, as President Obama has said, there is no shortcut to peace. These issues can only be resolved through negotiations. Some of you may disagree, but that is our position. And I have to tell you, we're proud of the record that we've developed on issues of peace and on issues of security. As Valerie said, as others will say shortly, there's no easy path, there are no shortcuts. It is a daunting challenge. And as we just heard, not everyone is going to agree with all aspects of our approach. And that's the way it should be in our democracy. We welcome the debate. Nor does it mean we're always going to see eye to eye with Israel on every issue. Even the closest of allies disagree, and I know this will come as a surprise to you, just as Israelis disagree amongst themselves. When we disagree, we make our views clear. It's a sign of mutual respect. It's a sign of a relationship robust enough and mature enough to overcome whatever tactical differences we may have. But here's what does concern us. Here's what could actually harm U.S.-Israeli relations and the security of the Jewish state, and that's subjecting either to the vagaries of partisan politics or turning them into election year talking points. This is not about stifling discussion or disagreement or dissent. It's about a very simple proposition. When it comes to discussing U.S. policy toward Israel in our political arena, by all means, let's question each other's judgments, but let's not question each other's motives. In just a few short years, J Street has admirably stood for the idea that healthy policy debate need not descend into division, particularly when our shared interests are so profound. Your slogan is pro-Israel, pro-peace. For generations, there's been a broad bipartisan consensus in the United States on those ideas. The stakes are too high for us and for Israel to let that change now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tony, for those inspiring and supportive remarks. We've done a scientific study of the audience reaction, and I'm happy to report to you that you're in favor of health care and against loose talk of war. You are also in favor, as J Street is, of a peaceful settlement in the Middle East leading to a two-state solution, because we all know that without a two-state solution, Israel cannot survive as a Jewish and a democratic state. And we're going to turn now to hear from two thoughtful experts who will build on Tony's discussion and talk to us about the steps that need to be taken to advance the objective of a two-state solution. Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer is currently the S. Daniel Abraham Professor of Middle Eastern Policy Studies at Princeton University. He served as the American ambassador to Israel from 2001 to 2005, and before that as ambassador to Egypt. And during his long and distinguished career, he served in a number of senior posts in the State Department and in the Middle East. And he was an advisor to and surrogate for President Obama when he was presidential candidate in 2008. Anne Marie Slaughter served most recently as director of the policy planning staff in the State Department and is now back at Princeton, where she now serves as a professor of politics at the Woodrow Wilson School, where she was formerly the dean. After each of them make their initial presentations, Jeremy Ben-Ami will moderate a discussion with them and with the audience about this vital question. And he will also take questions from you on cards that you will be asked to fill out. So it is my great pleasure now to introduce our two guest panelists and our President, Jeremy Ben-Ami, for the discussion. Thank you.
So Dan, go straight in. Good afternoon. This is a magical ballroom. We're a couple of thousand people who are enthusiastic and committed and persuaded about peace, about security for Israelis, Palestinians, and Americans have gathered to lend support for the proposition that a two-state solution can still be effected. It's a magical place not only because of your enthusiasm, but because when you leave this ballroom, you return to a Washington which is not as persuaded and which is not as committed to the idea that the United States needs to lead in the effort to bring about a two-state solution. Since leaving government service about 6 years ago, and while I've been at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School, I've returned to Washington often to serve on working groups and policy planning groups and other fora in which we have tried to provide advice and input to the administrations, first the Bush administration, now the Obama administration, on what might be done to advance the prospects of peace in the Middle East. Unfortunately, the advice that we've given, whether it's been good or bad or indifferent, has been greeted with what I've come to call the Washington consensus of naysayers. There is a mood and an attitude outside of this ballroom which suggests that the price that the United States would have to pay in terms of diplomacy, in terms of political commitment, in terms of the investment not just of our resources, but of our diplomatic strengths, may be too high. And that Washington consensus needs to be beaten back. Because if you, those supporters of J Street who have gathered here and who are going to infuse the rest of Washington, at least tomorrow, with your enthusiasm, if you're going to have an impact, you're going to have to impact this sense that nothing can be done. Now, what constitutes this so-called Washington consensus? There are about 15 characteristics. I won't go through all of them, but I'll give you a flavor of what you hear when you sit in these working groups in Washington. And I'm being honest with you, this is what you hear. First of all, it's too hard. As though what we ask of our military is not hard, and therefore we can't ask something hard of our diplomats. You just heard from Tony Blinken how you can be smart and tough, and we can do hard diplomacy. No guarantee of success, but without trying to do hard diplomacy, I can guarantee you failure. So the argument that it's too hard makes no sense. And then you hear the argument, well, let's just live with the status quo, because perhaps the conflict needs to ripen. You know, there's this theory in political science about ripeness, about two sides in a conflict that need to reach a hurting stalemate. Well, my goodness. We reached that hurting stalemate years ago. And this is not only ripe, it's a little overripe. Then you get to the idea, well, we can't act now because leaders are weak or leaders are unwilling. And it may be that, in fact, one of the key ingredients to a movement forward in the peace process is a sense of leadership on the part of one or two or all of the parties. In fact, if you study the history of the peace process in the last 30 or 35 years, it always required a leader to step forward. But it doesn't require all the leaders to step forward simultaneously. And that means that in the absence of leadership from the region, we can expect leadership and we can demand leadership from Washington. We also hear, and we particularly heard over the past few weeks when Prime Minister Netanyahu was in town, this may not be a time for Israel to take risks. And indeed, it is a region, I think my colleague Anne-Marie Slaughter is going to talk about some of the regional issues. This is a region undergoing substantial change, and change whose direction is uncertain. And so there could be a tendency on the part of leadership to hunker down and to try to await some certainty about the direction of change in order not to take risks. But for the very reasons that Tony Blinken noted with respect to the invasion of the Israeli embassy last September, this may be exactly the moment when Israel should be considering the risks of peacemaking with its Palestinian neighbors. After all, the direction of change in the Arab world is not necessarily favorable. We're seeing Islamist governments come to power in Egypt, in Tunisia, likely in Libya. You see the uncertainty of change in places like Syria and Yemen and elsewhere. How much more important would it be now for Israel to resolve its conflict with Palestinians and to show the Arab world that there is an alternative to the persistence of the Arab-Israeli conflict? Now, my sources for arguing this are a little bit interesting. Yitzhak Rabin and King Abdullah. Because both of them, in the last 20 years, came to the same conclusion, that the Arab-Israeli conflict had become a burden on the shoulders of leaders in this region when facing up to the real threat. In Rabin's time, the over-the-horizon threat, and in King Abdullah's time, the emerging threat of Iran. And if you go back to 1992, Rabin's first visit to Washington, and 2002, the year of the articulation of the Arab Peace Initiative, both of these far-sighted leaders understood that the Arab-Israeli conflict's time for resolution had come. And we are now 10 years later, and we haven't fulfilled that requirement. So this is the moment to take those risks for peace. And finally, among this list of 15 or so reasons, the one that's most extraordinary is, well, what if we fail? And you hear this from otherwise intelligent people. It's possible. You try policies not because you're guaranteed of success, because of the intrinsic importance of trying to achieve success. And you try policies not because you're guaranteed that you won't fail, but you have the agility and the creativity to avoid failure and to try to make those policies work. Now, how would that work in the peace process? And as we look ahead, how do we look at a process and a paradigm in a context in which we're living, in which it does look relatively difficult? Let me distinguish between those two for the next few moments. I think the paradigm of peacemaking should remain unchanged. No matter how hard we try, and no matter how hard seminars and conferences, and in fact my class at Princeton will examine next semester, there is no alternative to a two-state solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict. This was first articulated in the 1930s. It was re-articulated in the 1940s. And we've been dancing around this reality for 80 years. This conflict between Israelis and Palestinians must end with the partition of the land that both love and both aspire to control, but in which both can live as peaceful neighbors together. Now, to achieve that paradigm, there are a number of ways forward. Recently, I articulated a strategy which suggested that there are at least 3, perhaps 4 elements which need to be considered in order to move the idea of peacemaking forward. One is, and I hope I can say this after November as well, the announcement of Obama parameters. In other words, the idea that the United States will take what the two sides had negotiated over the course of the last 20 years, bring it together as much as possible, and treat it a little bit like a funnel. In other words, suggest to the parties that they negotiate within those parameters, but heading towards the coalescence and convergence of their views, with an active role by the United States in bridging those differences that emerge creatively. You know, there's one of these mantras about the peace process that we know the way this thing will end. We're not exactly sure how it will end. I think both sides, through public opinion polls and through anecdotes over the years, do have a fairly good sense of what the major kinds of trade-offs and concessions will have to be as they reach an agreement. But it will be required for those two parties to reach that agreement voluntarily. No one's going to impose a settlement on them, but they can be guided through this funnel towards an outcome in which the differences between them are not so formidable, and which creative ideas can bridge those differences. The President tried to articulate this last May in the idea of starting negotiations with borders and security. I would suggest that that's a good start, but it doesn't allow the sides to actually take advantage of putting all of the issues on the table at one time. Because if you're going to talk about borders and security, you're going to have to talk about Jerusalem, and you're going to have to talk about refugees, and you're going to have to talk about economic cooperation and the electromagnetic spectrum, and you name it. And so why not articulate a full set of Obama parameters that suggests to the parties, this is where we think you should start, because it's where you have left off in previous negotiations. But as you do that, negotiations will benefit from changes in behavior. It is probably not realistic, and we've had this experience, it's probably not realistic to assume that either side is going to make a confidence-building gesture to the others in advance of negotiations. But in the context of negotiations, we should be demanding of both sides that they do what they said they would do when they accepted the roadmap in 2002. Freeze the settlements. You can stay standing, I got a few more. Permit Palestinian mobility in order to build their economy and their state institutions. Destroy the infrastructure of Palestinian terrorism.
Forestall.
And build the infrastructure of a Palestinian state. These are not just the requirements imposed by the outside in the roadmap. These are the requirements that the two sides accepted. And in the context of a negotiation, we should be demanding that they actually fulfill those requirements.
Hear, hear.
But there's another element. Third element is for two societies to undergo what has begun to some extent, but needs to intensify. And that is, how do you engage the two populations that in some respects will have a veto over whether or not peace is possible, but today don't believe they have a stake in this process? I'm talking about settlers and refugees. Now, we think it's easy, stop the settlements, deal with the refugee issue, and it's not. There are hundreds of thousands of Israelis who have made their lives over the Green Line. There are a couple of million of Palestinians who believe in the right of return. And it is far too long that we have not found a way to engage these two communities in this broader search for peace. Internal dialogues, thinking through the consequences of giving up dreams that have been held so dearly for so many years. It will be hard for refugees to understand that most of them are not going back to the homes that their parents and grandparents left. And it will be hard for settlers to go home to places that they left in order to establish residences in the West Bank and in the Golan Heights. And we can't ignore this. We talk about freezing settlements, we talk about a solution to the refugee issue, I would just suggest that we treat this with a sensitivity and with some far-reaching ideas of how to bring these two communities into a peacemaking process, even as governments engage on the hard issues that have to be negotiated. Let me finish with just one word on process. Because I said at the beginning that there's paradigms and there's process. There is no alternative to the paradigm of a two-state solution, but there is no one way of getting there. It may be through bilateral negotiations, it may be through an international conference, it may be through proximity talks, it may be through direct talks. It doesn't matter. And we need to spend less time on getting the process right and more time on getting the substance right.
Yeah.
So as you heard from Valerie, Jarrett, and Tony Blinken, I join them in congratulating you, number one, for your commitment. I congratulate J Street on the degree to which it has brought to our community, the American political community and the Jewish community, a real debate about these critical issues that need to be debated. And I wish you Godspeed as you take the magic of this ballroom to the real world outside of the ballroom and win the argument for peace. Thank you very much.
That's a hard act to follow. I suppose I could just ask you to keep standing through my remarks. So I spend a lot of time on Twitter. I have about 27,000 followers around the world, and I spend a lot of time on Twitter because it connects me to people in many different countries, but also of many different beliefs. Far beyond certainly my community in this town, but even the academic community, the global academic community. And I spend a lot of time forwarding articles and messages and videos and personal testimonies about Syria and Egypt, and Yemen, Bahrain, and Libya. And whenever I send out a message about the suffering, the detention without trial, the civilian deaths from armed force in all of these countries, I now get messages back that say to me, "What about the Palestinians?" I am not for a minute going to say there are no differences between what's happening in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, in Egypt. There are many differences between those circumstances and what is happening between Israel and the Palestinians. There are many differences, but there are some similarities. And when I hear back from voices that I can shut out here in Washington, I can shut out in Princeton, but I can't shut them out in an open forum where I reach out to the world and the world answers me. And I don't think there's a better illustration of why staying deeply and actively engaged in the peace process is so much in our interests, in the United States' interests, not only for all the reasons that Dan Kurtzer just told you, but also for our interests in the region. In the first place, not being engaged in the peace process, not actively every day, as much as we possibly can, engaging on the issues of peace between Israel and Palestine, that silence, that failure to engage, undercuts what we say everywhere else in the region. I am the first to know that perfect consistency, or even primary consistency, is impossible. We treat Bahrain differently than we acted in Libya. We act in Syria differently. There are obvious different circumstances in all these cases. But we cannot say, as we have been saying for over a year, that we stand for democracy and human rights and basic justice for the people of the Middle East. And President Obama and Secretary Clinton and every representative of the administration have given speeches on democracy and human rights and justice across the Middle East. We cannot be saying that unless we're doing everything we can to bring democracy and human rights and justice to the Palestinians. And as you've heard, and as Peter Beinart has just pointed out in his very powerful book, in guaranteeing that there's democracy and human rights and justice for the Palestinians is also the best guarantee for continued democracy, justice, and human rights in Israel. So now let me talk about our relations with the other governments in the region. You know, our relations are strained both with the old governments of the Middle East and of the new emerging governments of the Middle East. And in both cases, doing everything we can for peace and actually achieving, again, not a process, but an agreement, would tremendously strengthen our relations with every other government. With respect to the traditional governments, the governments we have supported for 30 years, the former government of Egypt, the government of Saudi Arabia, the government of Jordan, the government of Morocco, those governments are seeking as best they can to reform, to head off the kinds of democratic movements, of revolutions we've seen elsewhere. They desperately want us to be engaged in the peace process. Seeing us engaged in the peace process, seeing us push as hard as we can, bringing the parties together, establishing parameters, is the best way that they can gain credibility to work with us, and we are pushing them very hard for reform, to actually move ahead without revolution and hopefully without bloodshed. But the new governments, it's every bit as important. We don't yet know what fully is emerging. We have had an election in Tunisia, we're having elections in Egypt, Yemen, still extremely tenuous. We don't know, of course, what will happen in Syria, but in all those cases, it is certain that whatever governments emerge, they will want us even more than their predecessors did to actively engage in a peace process. So from the perspective of how we engage with the people of the Middle East, but equally importantly, how we engage with all those governments, old or new, the peace process is strongly in our interests. Now, I want to shift gears for a minute, because we spend so much time talking about the threats that come from the Middle East, and there are many. There are economic threats, there are security threats, but we forget to imagine what the opportunities could be. Ambassador Kurtzer talked about magic. Let's dream for a minute. Let's just imagine what it would be to have a lasting and durable peace, a two-state peace, where Palestinians and Israelis could live side by side in a democracy, in human rights, in justice, and in prosperity. Just imagine for a minute what that would permit the United States to do. Let's start with a regional architecture in the Middle East. The Obama administration has spent an enormous amount of time working on regional institutions in other parts of the world. In Africa, with the African Union and with many sub-regional institutions. In Asia, we've spent an enormous amount of time working on the East Asia Summit, on the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and various other fora where we can engage. The Middle East has long been the least institutionalized part of the world. It's actually been quite remarkable what the Arab League has been willing to do with respect to Libya and now with Syria, and the Organization of the Islamic Conference and the Gulf Cooperation Council. But of course, all of those are partial institutions, and they're all relatively weak institutions. Just imagine if you could have an institution of Turkey, Israel, Egypt, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, just in the core of the Middle East, actually working to establish a stronger security throughout the Middle East against Iran, if that's necessary, or simply to assure, it is necessary now, but I'm taking you further into the future. But just imagine if you had an actual security institution that included Israel with those other states. And take it broader and imagine an institution that starts with Morocco, goes to Israel, and goes all the way to India. That would be an environment and a set of institutions that would establish Middle Eastern security and U.S. security going forward for decades. And then just think about the economic possibilities. We are so busy thinking about all the problems that we don't allow ourselves to imagine a Mediterranean economic union that would be the equivalent of the European Union. The European Union has laid the foundations, but of course, as long as there is no peace between Israel and its neighbors, you can't begin to imagine what this could actually be. And Israel would be absolutely essential. Even now, there are proposals for Israel and Turkey and Cyprus and Greece to actually engage in an energy partnership that would then be the core of a larger economic partnership. I say that, you look at me, you think, well, of course, that's impossible. Not Cyprus to begin with, but more fundamentally, you can't imagine Turkey and Israel actually engaging in an economic integration scheme of any kind. Just imagine if there was a peace. And just imagine how important Israel would be to that entire sub-region and the entire Mediterranean. And now imagine what Israel could do with respect to all the other issues that the Obama administration, Secretary Clinton, have spent their time on. The kinds of issues we don't talk about so much as we think about the traditional security problems of the Middle East. They are issues of development, of technology, of entrepreneurship, of water security, and food security. When I think about all those issues, I long to be able to engage Israel in the way and the role that Israel ought to play. There is no greater source of technology and innovation in the Middle East. There are few greater sources in the world. There's no country that understands more about water security. There's no country that understands more about how to actually transform environmentally challenged areas and deserts into places capable of fulfilling their own agricultural needs. The idea of Israel as a development partner, of Israel and India as development partners, both in the Middle East, but then indeed in Africa and other parts of the world. When President Obama held a conference here in Washington for entrepreneurs across the Middle East, they were mostly entrepreneurs from Muslim countries, But we at the State Department insisted that there should be some Israeli entrepreneurs as well, because of course there really are few places that are more entrepreneurial. The combination of those young Israelis and young Jordanians and Egyptians and Iraqis from all across the Middle East gave you an idea of what could actually be. If we're going to think about the importance of the peace process and why the United States has to be in the lead on the peace process, I don't think we can get there simply by talking about overcoming threats. We have to get there with a vision of what Israel and Palestine could be and what Israel and Palestine could be in a larger Middle East, in a larger set of security structures, economic communities, and honestly, leadership on many of the most important issues that we face as a world. So finally, if in fact the United States were to take the lead and succeed working as a leader and as a partner to achieve a peace, it would also be an extraordinary example of self-correction by a nation that recognizes it's heading in the wrong direction, but turning itself around. Peter Beinart talks about non-democratic Israel. That is a hard thing for him to write. It's a hard thing for me to say. But I grew up in non-democratic America. I grew up in Virginia in the 1960s. That was not a democracy. All people were not able to vote equally. Separate but equal was not equal. We did not deliver on the promises of our own values. And I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, home of Thomas Jefferson, home of that most fundamental value of all human beings are created equal. The United States recognized through the energies of people like all of you that we were not being true to our values. We were willing to hold ourselves to our own highest standards and change. My house in Princeton was built in the 1880s. In the library, in a Victorian library, hang two portraits. They are the portraits of my husband's great-grandparents from Budapest, his Jewish great-grandparents from Budapest. It's very powerful to me, as I look at these two portraits, they face each other, that a couple that we, of course, never knew and frankly could not possibly have imagined us in this country, who we are, coming together. It's very powerful that they face each other for at least as long as we're alive. It's even more powerful and poignant because my husband's great-grandmother died at Auschwitz. Fighting tyranny, fighting murderous tyranny for liberty, democracy, and dignity is as much Israel's birthright as it is the United States' birthright. To live up to that heritage, just as the United States often has to hold true to our own and change course to live up to our own highest values. To turn and to make a just and sustainable peace with the Palestinians and with the rest of the Middle East, with the United States standing side by side as leader, as catalyst, and as partner. To make that peace will vindicate those values of liberty and democracy and justice throughout Israel, throughout Palestine, and throughout the region, and will set an example for the world. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dan and Anne-Marie. You've probably noticed that there are a number of folks walking through the audience taking cards. I have seen hundreds of cards flowing towards the front table, of which I'm going to get a handful passed to me, and we'll begin conversation here about the administration's record to date, about what the options are moving forward, about how can America really make a difference, because obviously our whole purpose in J Street is to create the political space to make that happen. And I want to pick up, Dan, and I'll flip through the cards once we get into the first question. I want to pick up on your notion that following the elections, essentially, that a set of parameters, let's call them the Obama parameters, we could also call them the Romney parameters, but it's hard to imagine. But the next president's parameters, the concept is that the American leader needs to step forward with outlines. What happens if the sides say no?
Well, this is a variation on the theme of why enter into a process that may not succeed. And the reality is that the first answers we're likely to get under any peace process strategy are going to be no. That's been the history of the peace process. The question that I pose all the time is U.S. policy sound and reasonable enough to sustain our diplomatic approach over a period of time? In other words, can we sustain the approach even if we start to get no for an answer? Now, if the policy is not sound, then it's not going to be sustainable. But if you have what I call this strategy, parameters, behavioral changes, I didn't even mention trying to activate the Arab Peace Initiative, track 2 ideas for approaching settlers and refugees and bringing them into the process, then even if you get initial no's, your diplomats, your envoys, your Secretary of State, and all of his or her advisors have something to work with. And we've had experiences in our successes in the Middle East where initial responses have been no. You take the James Baker diplomacy in 1991, when the first letter went to the Syrians and Israelis calling upon them to come to a conference, both sides said no thank you. And the Bush administration at that time did not take no for an answer because the approach was reasonable, it was sound, and there was a sense of diplomatic strength that the administration was willing to pursue in trying to activate the policy. So I don't know whether or not you're going to get a yes or no. I think you probably will get a no, but so what? Work on it.
So, Anne-Marie, you were in the first 2 years of the administration, and the first effort to put down essentially an American marker was to say there has to be a settlement freeze. And the parameters of that were relatively clear. It was, no means no, and that meant not in East Jerusalem, not, a previously started construction, yet at the first hint of non-acceptance of that parameter, it seemed that the strategy didn't hold. What is the reason that one would think that a second-term Democratic president or a new president would be able to sustain that strategy? Do you think from your experience that there is the stick-to-itiveness, there is the political space, there's the will to actually stick with it and do what Dan is saying?
I do. In a second administration, absolutely I do, in part because of the lessons learned in the first round. I agree with Dan that you have to be prepared to have people say no. From there, though, it's a combination of making clear that you mean what you say, but also being willing to engage with the process as it goes on. In other words, once we got people back to the negotiating table, then you keep the process going, but insisting, I think this is where the parameters idea is so important, you insist that it can't just be a process, that you're actually moving forward around a set of agreed lines. But I am quite convinced that a second Obama administration will in fact engage and stay engaged and will be the wiser for some of the lessons of the first Obama administration.
Dan, To what extent, one of the audience members wants to know, to what extent is an Obama visit to Jerusalem or to the region a real important reset step after the election?
I think it's important. Frankly, it should have taken place before now. The president, the president has been arguing the case for a two-state solution and the commitment of his administration for peace, but in a sense never took it to the Israeli people. I was with him. I was part of the campaign in 2008 when he visited Israel in the middle of that campaign. And he is able to make a far more persuasive case when he's in front of an audience and relating to people personally than from 6,000 miles away. So I think that, one of the important public diplomacy lessons that needs to be learned from the first term is if you're going to be committed to this policy, which I think the president is, and you're prepared to travel to Cairo and Riyadh, then you also have to be prepared to travel to Jerusalem and Ramallah and make your case directly to the people as well as to the governments.
A couple of questions about the Palestinian side. One question is it possible to make progress if you are leaving out of the equation one of the two key Palestinian political parties? And is it feasible for the U.S. to play this role if it really refuses to engage at all with any government that includes Hamas after some form of reconciliation agreement? On the flip side, what would be the impact and what do you assess as the possibility of the collapse of the PA and the structures that have been put in place to build the state you were talking about if there isn't progress made? So two questions related to the Palestinian side.
Maybe I'll take the first and you can have the second. So, we've both been talking about the U.S. And the role the U.S. has to play. I also do think there's an important role for the EU, and indeed this may be part of it. I just came back from Brussels over the weekend, and although conferences in Brussels are always about whether the EU and is the EU going to fall apart and is the EU actually playing a global role, that's what happens in Brussels. Interestingly, this year, David Ignatius, who was there, asked Cathy Ashton, who is the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, the minute she got up on stage, he immediately asked her, could you please brief us on the state of play with Iran? Now that's striking. 5 years ago, no Washington Post columnist would have asked an EU official for an update on Iran, but he asked it and needed to ask it because she's actually in the lead there as the quartet. The EU will, within 10 years, have 7,000 diplomats around the world. They will have a foreign service equal to ours. They are going to steadily play a more and more important role, although a very different one. And with respect to how you engage with both the PA and Hamas in a peace process, I do think there's more of a role in some ways for us to engage with the PA, to have two-track diplomacy, other kinds of diplomacy, so that ultimately you're going to have Hamas move to accept the conditions that we've put forward. Together with the PA, I think Hamas is moving. I think there's actually quite a lot of interesting evidence in that regard. But that's why we also have partners, so that we're not in a position of violating our own constraints. And yet in a negotiation, you often have to put together a kind of package deal.
Look, what's been interesting is that, on the one hand, in 2006, we demanded free and fair elections. And then when Palestinian Authority conducted those elections, we didn't like the results and we walked away from those results. The fact is that policy is always going to be a combination of principle and pragmatism. There is a consensus within our policy community, and I think probably more broadly, that a candidate for participation in the political process in the Middle East ought to eschew violence and ought to recognize Israel's right to exist. And I think it's fair, therefore, to ask Hamas to do these things. The question is, though, whether you enshrine those principles in stone or whether you provide a pathway for Hamas to actually try to achieve those purposes. And I'll give you one example now. Hamas is now responsible They don't do a terrific job, but they're now responsible for maintaining a ceasefire in Gaza. It's not exactly a renunciation of violence, but it gets you started on the road to something other than what was called the armed struggle. And so we need to find benchmarks along that road that suggest as Hamas does its own thinking and thinks through the consequences of its own policies, we can be responsive and not just kind of wait at the end of this long pathway for Hamas to reach the finish line.
You want to say anything about whether the PA will collapse?
No.
So I noticed that you avoided the question on the potential collapse of the PA, but let me keep pursuing that a little bit. If, just pursuing the Palestinian side one more step, if negotiations do not result in forward movement, if some sort of a new initiative from the administration doesn't, and the Palestinians continue to pursue UN route, what is your take on the advisability, the impact on this process of a renewed effort by the Palestinians to go to the UN if the type of diplomatic process you've outlined doesn't work, let's say in another year?
I wrote a piece in the Huffington Post last summer that said that Palestinian move to the UN could actually end up being a win-win situation. And I thought that the United States might have embraced it and helped shape it rather than stand in opposition to it. And I still think that that's the case. I think it's not too late to take what the Palestinians want from this process, which is the boost that diplomatic recognition will give them, but also to gain something for Israel. And one of the arguments, for example, that I made in the piece last summer, if you go back to the seminal resolution in this conflict, which is the UN Partition Resolution of 1947, it calls for the creation of an Arab state and a Jewish state in the area that had been mandated Palestine. And I thought that language could be crafted that the realization of Palestinian statehood and its recognition by the UN would be the fulfillment of the UN's call for an Arab state, just as Israel's existence is the fulfillment of the UN's call for a Jewish state. And you begin to address then what has become a very important issue in Israel. But it needs some creative crafting and some willingness to be creative in order to see that you can achieve a win-win outcome rather than simply stand in opposition to a Palestinian move.
Anne-Marie, in the context of the broader region, and Dan noted this in his remarks, I think tomorrow or the next day is the 10th anniversary of the Arab Peace Initiative. And in fact, J Street, I hope you all know, we're having a little event tomorrow as part of our lobby day in the same room where we're kicking off our advocacy in the afternoon with Tom Friedman, with Marwan Muasher, and with Yuval Rabin, representing the Israel Peace Initiative, to mark the 10th anniversary and to try to put the issue back on the agenda. Why do you think it is that Anne-Marie, why is it that initiative has never been seized? I mean, from within the State Department and the experience you've had, this would seem like the type of opportunity you could seize as an American diplomat to broaden this from the one-to-one reticent partners to make it a little bit more regional, as you pointed out. Is there something to be done there by the United States, and why is Israel not seizing that opportunity too?
Well, this, as you say, it's the 10th anniversary, right? So from 2002 to 2008, I can't answer that question specifically. I have written and argued absolutely that it did and does, although more on that in a second, provide an opportunity that should have been seized by both the U.S. and by Israel. I think by the time the U.S. was willing to do much more with respect to the Arab Peace Initiative, then Saudi Arabia was not willing to re-endorse it. And it was a fairly fragile, it was a bold move for Saudi Arabia to begin with, but always a sort of fragile coalition. And they, of course, faulted us with not rewarding them for having taken what they saw as a very bold step. And this goes back to the dynamics of negotiation. They do that. We should have, in my view, really seized on it, done some things that gave them confidence to continue, and then you get a more virtuous circle. At this point, you would need a kind of relaunch. You'd need a relaunch from the Saudi side, from with other Arab nations. It might be a sensible thing for Saudi Arabia to do, although, again, many of its partners are now in such flux. If so, then I absolutely think the prospect of a regional settlement together with a Israeli-Palestinian peace is one that is worth doing a great deal for. So but you have to do a lot more behind-the-scenes diplomacy at this point, I think, to get it relaunched.
Dan, would you see that as something that should be part of the consideration for a...
Yeah, for sure. I would add it in as a fourth critical element to the kind of strategic layout that I provided. And I agree with Anne-Marie fully that it's going to require some work now, because after 10 years, people have become a little bit cemented in their views, whether for or against. The immediate issues, I think the Arabs have understood that there's one element of the initiative that probably was missing. That there was nothing in it that called upon the Arabs to reach out to Israel. If you look at that last paragraph in the Arab Peace Initiative, it says, we're going to talk to the Americans and the Russians and the da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and it doesn't mention Israel at all. Israel's kind of the real address here, and so I think if we do have a kind of reformulation of this, that's going to be critical. And I think what Yuval Rabin has started is the idea that Israel doesn't have to accept the Arab initiative so much as to have a parallel Israeli initiative that represents a coherent approach so that the two can stand up vis-a-vis each other, and then you start from there.
Great. Just a couple more questions, and then unfortunately we have to draw this to a close. One of the issues that has been introduced into the diplomatic mix over the last couple of years is this notion of recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. And I'm just wondering, as folks with a longer history on this issue, and this is something that I know our people hear a lot in the field, if the Palestinians aren't willing to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, then how can we even begin to talk? And I'm wondering if you could provide some help to our folks in understanding the history of this and maybe give them some talking points that could be of help.
You know, if anybody here ever has a chance to hear Moshe Halbertal, professor of philosophy at Hebrew University, talk about this issue, he can do it far more cogently than I. Number one, Israel has not defined itself yet in a manner that would require other countries to recognize its existence as a quote-unquote Jewish state. Egypt was not required to do so in a treaty. Jordan was not required to do so. Why the bar has been raised with respect to Palestinians doesn't make a lot of sense, number one. Number two, let me step out of my, quasi-diplomatic hat and put on my Jewish hat for a moment. Israel doesn't need anybody's recognition for what it is.
Hear, hear.
It's the fulfillment of the Jewish people's aspirations and hopes for self-determination and for independence, and it's up to Israel to define itself. It gains nothing from someone else mouthing words that may or may not have meaning. So I think this has become a negotiating issue, and it's now taken on a size and a proportion that far outstrips its intrinsic value. I had the privilege and the challenge of working for 4 years with Prime Minister Sharon when I was the United States ambassador. And the way he phrased it is that the ultimate end of this conflict will come when other people recognize that the Jews do have a right to establish their state in the homeland of the Jewish people. As an outcome of a long-term process of reaching peace, that's a reasonable expectation. It goes back to Anne-Marie's idea of having some vision of the future. But as a precondition or as a requirement to get into the process of peacemaking, I think it's an excuse for not negotiating peace.
So let me end. You both come from the world of academia at the moment and work with students, and we have about 650 students who are with us at the conference here. And so the question is, what is the advice that you would give to the individual students who are involved in the J Street U chapters? You see the environment on campus, you know what students are able to do. How can they help to promote meaningful change on this issue? Let me start with Anne-Marie.
That's a great question. Well, the first thing you can do is to use the technology that is your world in ways that will engage young Israelis, but youth beyond. To me, the move by these young Israeli architects reaching out to Iran, Israel loves Iran. It's an extraordinary statement. It's a statement that the young people across the Middle East and in many other countries around the world are saying, which is, we are not fully represented by our government. You know, any government, any people, there's a government and there's a population, but the combination of globalization and technology means people are now able to talk to people in a way they have never been able to before, and we need to hear your voices. There are many, many young people in Israel who I think would like to be heard, who would like to engage, who don't feel that they're heard by their government. I think that's true of young Palestinians. We need to hear you. So what you can do is use those media, Facebook, Twitter, your email networks. Make your own diplomatic community. Make clear that there are voices that are not the voices that we hear over and over and over again in what are often very tired ruts. So it's your world. Take it.
I would just offer, in addition to what Anne-Marie said, one don't and one do. First of all, don't succumb to the Washington consensus. Stay optimistic. But second, in addition to using the technology and the social networks, many of you are still on college campuses. Anne-Marie and I spend a lot of time lecturing on college campuses. I just came back from California at a campus where the two quote-unquote sides don't talk to each other. And if there's one thing you can do back on your campuses is foster the idea of dialogue at home, because the more the American people talk to each other about this issue, the less polarized we will become. And as you heard from Tony Blinken, that's the first rule of politics now.
That's true. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank both of these incredible scholars and public servants, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Yeah.